Welcome, everybody. Today we're going to read some Hegel, the Phenomenology of Spirit. We're going to read the introduction. So we're on aphorism 73. Let me just zoom in a little bit. It is a natural assumption that in philosophy, before we start to deal with its proper subject matter vis-a-vis the actual cognition of what truly is, one must first of all come to an understanding about cognition, which is regarded either as the instrument to get hold of the absolute, or as the medium through which one discovers it. A certain uneasiness seems justified, partly because there are different types of cognition, and one of them might be more appropriate than the other for the attainment of this goal. So that we could make a bad choice of means, and particularly and partly because cognition is a faculty of a definite kind and scope, and thus, without a more precise definition of its nature and limits, we might grasp clouds of error instead of the heaven of truth. This feeling of uneasiness is surely bound to be transformed into the conviction that the whole project of securing for consciousness through cognition that exists in itself is absurd, and that there is a boundary between cognition and the absolute that completely separates them. For if cognition is the instrument for getting hold of absolute being, it is obvious that the use of an instrument on a thing certainly does not let it be what it is for itself, but rather sets out to reshape and alter it. If, on the other hand, cognition is not an instrument of our activity, but a more or less passive medium through which the light of truth reaches us, then again we do not receive the truth as it is in itself, but only as it exists through and in this medium. Either way, we employ a means which immediately brings about the opposite of its own end. Or rather, that is really absurd, is what we should make use of as a means at all. It would seem to be sure that this evil could be remedied through an acquaintance with the way in which the instrument works. For this would enable us to eliminate from the representation of the absolute, which we have gained through it whatever is due to the instrument, and thus get the truth in its purity. But this improvement would in fact only bring us back to where we were before. If we remove from the reshaped thing what that instrument has done to it, then the thing here, the absolute, becomes for us exactly what it was before this, accordingly superfluous effort. On the other hand, if the absolute is supposed merely to be brought nearer to us through this instrument without anything in it being altered, like a bird caught on a lime twig, it would surely laugh our little ruse to scorn, if it were not with us, in and for itself all along, and of its own volition. For a ruse is just what cognition would be in such a case, since it would, with its manifold exertions, be giving itself the air of doing something quite different from creating, or merely immediate and therefore effortless relationship. Or, if by testing cognition, which we receive of as a medium, we get to know the law of its refraction, it is again useless to subtract this from the end result, for it is not the refraction of the ray, but the ray itself whereby the truth reaches us. This is cognition, and if this were removed, all that would be indicated would be a pure direction or a blank space. So let's have a look at the end of the book, at the notes. So we're on 73, and we're going to go down to the notes that Findlay has written. So I'm going up too far. Down too far. Okay, we're nearly there. Okay, so this is the introduction. This is the notes at the back of the book, page 505. It is a natural idea that before engaging in philosophical inquiry, one should first examine the instrument or medium of such knowledge, Locke and Kant. Perhaps it is good or a bad instrument, perhaps no good at all for knowledge of what absolutely is, since it modifies or distorts the object. It is quite vain, however, to try to eliminate the refracting and transforming powers of the instrument and so-called arrive at the intrinsic notion of the thing. For if what is absolutely is cannot be reached by our faculty of knowledge, with all its refraction and transforming power, there is no sense in supposing that it can be reached by dispensing with or discounting the work of this faculty and the course it has to take. Remove the way truth affects us, and nothing at all remains. 74. Meanwhile, if the fear of falling into error sets up a mistrust of science, which in the absence of such scruples gets on with the work itself and actually cognize something, it is hard to see why we should not turn around and mistrust this very mistrust. Should we not be concerned as to whether this fear of error is not just the error itself? Indeed, this fear takes something, a great deal in fact, for granted as truth, supporting its scruples and inferences on what is itself in need of prior scrutiny to see if it is true. To be specific, it takes for granted certain ideas about cognition as an instrument and as a medium, and assumes that there is a difference between ourselves and this cognition. Above all, it presupposes that the absolute stands on one side and cognition on the other, independent and separated from it, and yet is something real, or in other words, it presupposes that cognition, which since it is excluded from the absolute, is surely outside of the truth as well, is nevertheless true, an assumption whereby what calls itself fear of error reveals itself rather as a fear of the truth. But if we doubt the ability of knowledge to reach what absolutely is, why not doubt the doubt and so on? It may be pointed out further that the notion of knowledge as a medium or instrument which stands in an external relation to what absolutely is, which is quite separate from it, is a wholly questionable notion, which makes knowledge impossible from the start. In our fear of error, we are excluding the impossibility of knowledge. Okay, let's go to 75. This conclusion stems from the fact that the absolute alone is true, or the truth alone is absolute. One may set this aside on the grounds that there is a type of cognition, which, though it does not cognize the absolute as science aims to, is still true, and that cognition in general, though it be incapable of grasping the absolute, is still capable of grasping other kinds of truth, which we gradually come to see that this kind of talk, which goes back and forth, only leads to a hazy distinction between an absolute truth and some other kind of truth, and that words like absolute cognition, etc., presuppose a meaning which has yet to be ascertained. That we might have knowledge of a sort, for example, phenomena, but not of what absolutely is a wholly obscure notion to which no one has managed to give any clear meaning. Even knowledge of shine, Erscheinung, Hegel is later on to insist, is knowledge of how things really appear to be or manifestly are. 76. Instead of troubling ourselves with such useless ideas and locutions about cognition as an instrument for getting hold of the absolute, or as a medium through which we view the truth, relationships which surely in the end are what all these ideas of cognition cut off from the absolute, and an absolute separated from cognition amount to. Instead of putting up with excuses which create the incapacity of science by assuming relationships of this kind in order to be exempt from the hard work of science, while at the same time giving the impression of working seriously and zealously, instead of bothering to refute all these ideas, we could reject them out of hand as adventitious and arbitrary, and the words associated with them, like absolute cognition, objective and subjective, and countless others whose meaning is assumed to be generally familiar, could even be regarded as so much deception. For to give the impression that their meaning is generally well known, or that their notion is comprehended, looks more like an attempt to avoid the main problem, which is precisely to provide this notion. We could, with better justification, simply spare ourselves the trouble of paying any attention whatever to such ideas and locutions, for they are intended to ward off science itself and constitute merely an empty appearance of knowing, which vanishes immediately as soon as science comes on the scene. But science, just because it comes on the scene, is itself an appearance. In coming on the scene, it is not yet science in its developed and unfolded truth. In this connection, it makes no difference whether we think of science as the appearance because it comes on the scene alongside another mode of knowledge, or whether we call that other untrue knowledge its manifestation. In any case, science must liberate itself from this semblance, and it can do so only by turning against it. For when confronted with a knowledge that is without truth, science can neither merely reject it as an ordinary way of looking at things while assuring us that its science is a quite different sort of cognition for which that ordinary knowledge is of no account. No account whatsoever, nor can it appeal to the vulgar view, for the intimations it gives us of something better to come. But the former assurance, science, would be declaring its power to lie simply in its being. But the untrue knowledge likewise appeals to the fact that it is, and assures us that for it science is of no account. One bare assurance is worth just as much as another. Still less can science appeal to whatever intimations of something better it may detect in the cognition that is without truth, to the signs which point in the direction of science. For one thing, it would only be appealing again to what merely is, and for another, it would only be appealing to itself, and to itself in the mode in which it exists in the cognition that is without truth. In other words, it would be appealing to an inferior form of its being, to the way it appears rather than to what it is in and for itself. It is for this reason that an exposition of how knowledge makes its appearance will be here undertaken. 76. All these confused conceptions which make knowledge inherently impossible must be dismissed. The actual development of knowledge itself sets them aside, but knowledge in its first appearance is itself merely apparent and so defective. Science cannot merely claim to be better than such apparent knowledge, for this is to put itself on the level of the latter, and to rely on its mere existence. Nor can it appeal to its own rudimentary presence in an apparent knowledge, for that is not, in apparent knowledge, specially distinctive. We must accordingly say what apparent knowledge really is. Okay, back to the normal text. We read 76. Now we'll read 77. Now, because it has only phenomenal knowledge for its object, this exposition seems not to be science, free and self-moving in its own particular shape. Yet from this standpoint, it can be regarded as the path of the natural consciousness which presses forward to true knowledge, or as the way of the soul which journeys through the series of its own configurations, as though they were the stations appointed for it by its own nature, so that it may purify itself for the life of the spirit and achieve finally through a completed experience of itself, the awareness of what it really is in itself. Apparent knowledge in all its varied forms is the path taken by the natural consciousness till it reaches true knowledge. Along this path, soul becomes purified into spirit. by a complete experience of itself, it comes to know what it is, what in itself is. 78. Natural consciousness will show itself to be only the notion of knowledge, or in other words, not to be real knowledge, but since it directly takes itself to be real knowledge, this path has a negative significance for it. And what is in fact the realization of the notion counts for it rather as the loss of its own self, for it does lose its truth on this path. The road can therefore be regarded as the pathway of doubt, or more precisely as the way of despair. For what happens on it is not what is ordinarily understood when the word doubt is used, shilly-shallying about this or that presumed truth, followed by a return to that truth again, after the doubt has been properly or appropriately dispelled, so that at the end of the process, the matter is taken to be what it is in the first place. On the contrary, this path is the conscious insight into the untruth of phenomenal knowledge, for which the supreme reality is what is in truth only the unrealized notion. Therefore, this thoroughgoing skepticism is also not the skepticism with which an earnest zeal for truth and science fancies it has prepared and equipped itself in their service. The resolve in science not to give oneself over to the thoughts of others upon mere authority, but to examine everything for oneself and follow only one's own conviction, or better still, to produce everything oneself and accept only one's own deed is what is true. The series of configurations which consciousness goes through along this road is in reality the detailed history of the education of consciousness itself to the standpoint of science. That zealous resolve represents this education simplistically as something directly over and done with the making of the resolution. But the way of the soul is the actual fulfillment of the resolution, in contrast to the untruth of that view. Now, following one's own conviction is, of course, more than giving all oneself over to authority, but changing an opinion accepted on authority into an opinion held out of personal conviction does not necessarily alter the content of the opinion, or replace error with truth. The only difference between being caught up in a system of opinions and prejudices based on personal conviction and being caught up in one based on the authority of others lies in the added conceit that is innate in the former position, the skepticism that is directed against the whole range of phenomenal consciousness. On the other hand, renders the spirit for the first time competent to examine what truth is, for it brings about a state of despair about all the so-called natural ideas, thoughts, and opinions, regardless of whether they are called one's own or someone else's. Ideas with which the consciousness that sets out the examination of truth straightway is still filled and hampered, so that it is, in fact, incapable of carrying out what it wants to undertake. 78. In philosophy, fundamental beliefs are always being shaken and are not restored in the same form as in the case of ordinary doubt. We are not merely trained thinkers who are now trying to think for themselves. We are people who, for the first time, are really learning how to think, for whom the results of all training are in question. Philosophical skepticism is radical, not piecemeal. 79. The necessary progression and interconnection of the forms of the unreal consciousness will by itself bring to pass the completion of the series. To make this more intelligible, it may be remarked in a preliminary and general way that the exposition of the untrue consciousness in its truth is not a merely negative procedure. The natural consciousness itself normally takes this one-sided view of it, and the knowledge which makes this one-sidedness its very essence is itself one of the patterns of incomplete consciousness which occurs on the road itself and will manifest itself in due course. This is just the skepticism which only ever sees pure nothingness in its result and abstracts from the fact that this nothingness is specifically the nothingness of that from which it results. It is only when it is taken as the result of that from which it emerges That is, in fact, the true result. In that case, it is itself a determinate nothingness, one which has a content. The skepticism that ends up with the bare abstraction of nothingness or emptiness cannot get any further from there, but must wait to see whether something new comes along and what it is in order to throw it too into the same empty abyss. But when, on the other hand, the result is conceived as it is in truth, namely as a determinate negation, a new form has thereby immediately arisen. And in the negation, the transition is made through which the progress through the complete series of forms comes about of itself. 79. But in philosophy, skepticism does not merely doubt. It always arrives at a determinate positive result, a position whose positive truth involves and is involved by the negation of the position just considered before. Purely negative skepticism is a delusive form of consciousness which is passed on the way. 80. But the goal is as necessarily fixed for knowledge as the serial progression. It is the point where knowledge no longer needs to go beyond itself, where knowledge finds itself, where notion corresponds to object and object to notion. Hence, the progress towards this goal is also unhalting, and short of it, no satisfaction is to be found at any of the stations on the way. Whatever is confined within the limits of a natural life cannot, by its own efforts, go beyond this immediate experience, but it is driven beyond it by something else, and this uprooting entails its death. Consciousness, however, is explicitly the notion of itself. Hence, it is something that goes beyond limits, and since these limits are its own, it is something that goes beyond itself. With the positing of a single particular, the beyond is also established for consciousness, even if it is only alongside a limited object, as the case of spatial intuition. Thus, consciousness suffers this violence at its own hands. It spoils its own limited satisfaction. When consciousness feels this violence, its anxiety may well make it retreat from the truth and strive to hold on to what it is in danger of losing. But it can find no peace. If it wishes to remain in a state of unthinking inertia, then thought troubles its thoughtlessness, and its own unrest disturbs its inertia. Or if it entrenches itself in sentimentality, which assures us that it finds everything to be good in its kind, then this assurance likewise suffers violence at the hands of reason. For precisely in so far as something is merely a kind, reason finds it not to be good. Or again, its fear of the truth may lead consciousness to hide from itself and others, behind the pretensions that its burning zeal for truth makes it difficult or even impossible to find any other truth but the unique truth of vanity, that of being at any rate cleverer than any thoughts that one gets by oneself or from others. This conceit, which understands how to belittle every truth in order to turn back into itself and gloat over its own understanding, which knows how to dissolve every thought and always find the same barren ego instead of any content, this is a satisfaction which we must leave to itself, for it flees from the universal and seeks only to be for itself. 80. The goal of knowledge is a situation where there is no longer an apparent element to be discounted and transcended, but where notion and object are mutually adequate. Consciousness, by its very nature, presses on to this goal, though it sometimes retreats in terror from the endless self-transcendence and affects to regard all positions of thought as vain and empty, or as good in their own kind, thereby increasing its own vain self-importance. 81. In addition to these preliminary general remarks about the manner and the necessity of the progression, it may be useful to say something about the method of carrying out the inquiry. If this exposition is viewed as a way of relating science to phenomenal knowledge, and as an investigation and examination of the reality of cognition, it would seem that it cannot take place without some presupposition, which can serve as its underlying criterion. For any examination consists in applying an accepted standard for in determining whether something is right or wrong on the basis of the resulting agreement or disagreement of the thing examined. Thus, the standard as such, and science likewise, if it were the criterion, is accepted as the essence or as the thing in itself. But here, where science has just begun to come on the scene, neither science nor anything else has yet justified itself as the essence or the in itself, and without something of the sort, it seems that no examination can take place. '81. I'll read 80 again. The goal of knowledge is a situation where there is no longer an apparent element to be discounted and transcended, but where notion and object are mutually adequate. Consciousness, by its very nature, presses on to this goal, though it sometimes retreats in terror from the endless self-transcendence and affects to regard all positions of thought as vain and empty, or as good in their own kind, thereby increasing its own vain self-importance. Okay, so I've just read 81, so I'll read it here. To progress in self-criticism, it seems that there must be a criterion which knowledge can apply to itself, but knowledge does not seem to possess any such criterion wherewithin it can test itself. So we're currently on 82, and I'm just going to scroll down to see. Okay, so we have up until 89. Yeah, we'll keep on reading until we finish this today. Okay. 82. This contradiction and its removal will become more definite if we call to mind the abstract determinations of truth and knowledge as they occur in consciousness. Consciousness simultaneously distinguishes itself from something and at the same time relates itself to it. Or, as it is said, something exists for consciousness, and the determinate aspect of this relating, or the being of something, for a consciousness is knowing. But we distinguish this being for another from being in itself. Whatever is related to knowledge or knowing is also distinguished from it and posited as existing outside of this relationship. This being in itself is called truth. Just what might be involved in these determinations is of no further concern to us here, since our objects is phenomenal knowledge. Its determinations too will at first be taken directly as they present themselves, and they do not present themselves very much as we have already apprehended them. So what does 82 say? Knowledge is always given as correlated with an independent, self-existent, objective something, the truth. The truth may be for consciousness, but it also is what it is in itself. 83. Now, if we inquire into the truth of knowledge, it seems that we are asking what knowledge is in itself. Yet in this inquiry, knowledge is our object, something that exists for us. And the in itself that would supposedly result from it would rather be the being of knowledge for us. What we asserted to be its essence would be not so much its truth, but rather just our knowledge of it. The essence or criterion would lie within ourselves, and that which was to be compared with it and about which a decision would be reached through this comparison would not necessarily have to recognize the validity of such a standard. 83. This independent, self-existent truth must, however, itself be a truth for consciousness, and this seems to make consciousness its own criterion, and to point to another self-existent truth with which the first truth can be compared, and so on. 84. The dissociation, or this semblance of dissociation and presupposition, is overcome by the nature of the object we are investigating. Consciousness provides its own criterion from within itself, so that the investigation becomes a comparison of consciousness with itself, for the distinction made above falls within it. In consciousness, one thing exists for another, i.e., consciousness regularly contains the determinateness of the moment of knowledge. At the same time, this other is to consciousness not merely for it, but is also outside of this relationship or exists in itself, the moment of truth. Thus, in what consciousness affirms from within itself as being in itself over the true, we have the standard which consciousness itself sets up by which to measure what it knows. If we designate knowledge as the notion, but the essence or the true as what exists or the object, then the examination consists in seeing whether the notion corresponds to the object. But if we call the essence or the in itself of the object the notion, and on the other hand, you understand by the object the notion itself as object vis-a-vis as it exists for another, then the examination consists in seeing whether the object corresponds to its notion. It is evident, of course, that the two procedures are the same, but the essential point to bear in mind throughout the whole investigation is that these two moments, notion and object, being for another and being in itself, both fall within that knowledge which we are investigating. Consequently, we do not need to import criteria or to make use of our own bright ideas and thoughts during the course of the inquiry. It is precisely when we leave these aside that we succeed in contemplating the matter in hand as it is in and for itself. 84. In reality, however, both the self-existent truth and the knowledge of it fall within consciousness, or otherwise put, the object as it intrinsically is, its essence on the one hand, and the object as an object for consciousness or a notion on the other. Both fall within consciousness, and the latter has to be made to conform to the former. Or, if we identify notion and essence, and the object is what this is for us, then we have to see the object conform to the notion. Both these processes are the same, and in them consciousness only applies its own criterion to itself. This paragraph seems pure objective idealism. Consciousness, in testing its ideas, its immanent contents, merely confronts them with other ideas or immanent contents. But it can also be interpreted as saying that what objects in themselves are is always more or less adequate, therein and for consciousness and in knowledge. It has merely to replace an inadequate by a more adequate revelation. 85. But not only is a contribution by us superfluous, since notion and object, the criterion, and what is to be tested are present in consciousness itself, but we are also spared the trouble of comparing the two and really testing them. So that, since what consciousness examines is its own self, all that is left to us to do is simply look on. For consciousness is, on the one hand, consciousness of the object, and on the other, consciousness of itself, consciousness of what for it is the true, and consciousness of its knowledge of the truth. Since both are for the same consciousness, this consciousness is itself their comparison. It is for this same consciousness to know whether its knowledge of the object corresponds to the object or not. The object, it is true, seems only to be for consciousness in the way that consciousness knows it. It seems that consciousness cannot, as it were, get behind the object as it exists for consciousness, so as to examine what the object is in itself, and hence, too, cannot test its own knowledge by that standard. But the distinction between the in itself and knowledge is already present in the very fact that consciousness knows an object at all. Something is for it, the in itself, and knowledge, or the being of the object for consciousness is for it another moment. Upon this distinction, which is present as a fact, the examination rests. If the comparison shows that these two moments do not correspond to one another, it would seem that consciousness must alter its knowledge to make it conform to the object. But in fact, in the alteration of the knowledge, the object itself alters for it too, for the knowledge that was present was essentially a knowledge of the object. As the knowledge changes, so too does the object, for it essentially belongs to this knowledge. Hence it comes to pass for consciousness that what it previously took to be the in itself is not an in itself, or that it was only and in itself for consciousness. Self-consciousness thus finds that its knowledge does not correspond to its object. The object itself does not stand the test. In other words, the criterion for testing is altered when that for which it was to have been the criterion fails to pass the test. And the testing is not only a testing of what we know, but also a testing of the criterion of what knowing is. 85. Consciousness itself tests itself and compares itself with its own object. We, the philosophical observers, can only observe it at work. Consciousness itself constantly changes its view of the object. What the object was intrinsically, an sich, becomes merely what it is for consciousness, and a new an sich develops. We may say that consciousness is adjusting itself to the reality of being, but it is more correct to say the reality of being is adjusting itself to consciousness. In this adjustment, the criterion applied by consciousness is itself being tested and transformed. 86. Inasmuch as the new true object issues from it, this dialectical movement which consciousness exercises on itself and which affects both its knowledge and its object is precisely what is called experience. In this connection, there is a moment in the process just mentioned which must be brought out more clearly. For through it, a new light will be thrown on the exposition which follows. Consciousness knows something, this object in the essence or the in itself, but it is also for consciousness the in itself. This is where the ambiguity of this truth enters. We see that consciousness now has two objects. One is the first in itself. The second is the being for consciousness of its in itself. The latter appears at first sight to be merely the reflection of consciousness into itself. What consciousness has in mind is not an object, but only its knowledge of that first object. But as was shown previously, the first object in being known is altered for consciousness. It ceases to be the in itself and becomes something that is the in itself only for consciousness. And this then is the true, the being for consciousness of this itself, this in itself, or in other words, this is the essence or the object of consciousness. This new object contains the nothingness of the first. It is what experience has made of it. So I'm going to read 86 and 87. So we'll read 86. For consciousness to negate what at first seemed absolutely objective, and for it to regard this absolute truth as a mere truth for consciousness, is for consciousness to have lived through an experience in the phenomenological sense, which always involves self-transcendence. 87. The exposition of the course of experience contains a moment in virtue of which it does not seem to agree with what is ordinarily understood by experience. This is the moment of transition from the first object to the object of it, to the other object which experience is said to be about. Our account implied that our knowledge of the first object, or the being for consciousness of the first in itself becomes the second object. It usually seems to be the case, on the contrary, that our experience of the untruth of our first notion comes by way of a second object, which we come upon by chance and externally, so that our part in all this is simply the pure apprehension of what it is, what is in, and for itself. From the present viewpoint, however, the new object shows itself to have come about through a reversal of consciousness itself. This way of looking at the matter is something contributed by us, by means of which the succession of experiences through which consciousness passes is raised into a scientific progression. But it is not known to the consciousness that we are observing. But as a matter of fact, we have here the same situation as the one discussed in regarding to the relation between our exposition and skepticism, vis-a-vis that in every case the result of an untrue mode of knowledge must not be allowed to run away into an empty nothing, but must necessarily be grasped as the nothing of that from which it results, a result which contains what was true in the preceding knowledge. It shows up here like this. Since what first appeared as the object sinks for consciousness to the level of its way of knowing it, and since the in itself becomes a being for consciousness of the in itself, the latter is now the new object. Here within, a new pattern of consciousness comes on the scene as well, for which the essence is something different from what it was in the preceding stage. It is this fact that guides the entire series of the patterns of consciousness in their necessary sequence. But it is just this necessity itself, or the origination of the new object, that presents itself to consciousness without its understanding how this happens, which proceed for us, as it were, behind the back of consciousness. Thus, in the movement of consciousness, there occurs a moment of being in itself, or being for us, which is not present to the consciousness comprehended in the experience itself. The content, however, of what presents itself to us does exist for it. We comprehend only the formal aspect of that content, or its pure origination. For it, what has thus arisen exists only as an object. For us, it appears at the same time as movement and process of becoming. 87. The progress of consciousness can be progress from consciousness. It can also be a progress for the phenomenological observer who is considering and commenting on consciousness. The phenomenological observer sees the link of negation and the resultant positiveness which springs from negation in the successive phases of consciousness, whereby for consciousness itself each step involves a surprising transition to a totally new object. The deep dialectic seen by the phenomenological observer goes on behind the back of consciousness itself. 88. Because of this necessity, the way to science is itself already science, and hence, in virtue of its content, is the science of the experience of consciousness. Science includes in its content the road to science, the account of its own essential experience. 89. The experience of itself which consciousness goes through can, in accordance with its own notion, comprehend nothing less than the entire system of consciousness, or the entire realm of the truth of spirit. For this reason, the movements of this truth are exhibited in their own proper determinateness, viz., as being not abstract moments, but as they are for consciousness, or as consciousness itself stands forth in its relation to them. Thus, the moments of the whole are patterns of consciousness. In pressing forward to its true existence, consciousness will arrive at a point at which it gets rid of its semblance of being burdened with something alien, with what is only for it, and some sort of other, at a point where appearance becomes identical with essence, so that its exposition will coincide at just this point with the authentic science of spirit. And finally, when consciousness itself grasps its own essence, it will signify the nature of absolute knowledge itself. The shapes of consciousness are not fully conscious of themselves as shapes of consciousness, nor of their place in a continuous conscious history until the end of the road is reached. So that is the introduction, just a straight reading for it. We have also read the A section the other day, sense certainty or this and meaning, meinen. So we're going to read some of the preface and some more of A section of consciousness. Until next time, take care.